Alright, so today I want to show you the variability that can occur within specific morphs in ball pythons. It's pretty amazing. You can actually have two ball pythons side by side and have the same exact genetic makeup, and you can have completely different appearances of those snakes. And I would say sometimes it comes down to the different lines within the gene. Sometimes you can see that in pastel. Sometimes you'll have like a really bright line of pastel that carries down the really bright offspring, and sometimes it can be completely random even within the same breeding and the same parents. So for example, this snake around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python, and I produce probably 50 bamboo, probably more than 50 hatchlings from this guy, and I'd say most of them, probably 90%, look pretty much like Bobby here. And it's kind of interesting. He's got a pretty unique, really a high contrast appearance to him, and he's got a lot of white coming up the sides, which is kind of unique for a bamboo. And as a matter of fact, I've actually produced probably 3 offspring from Bobby that didn't have hardly any white on the sides, and they had a really dark appearance compared to what the parents looked like. And it's kind of interesting with ball pythons. Sometimes they can just kind of randomly pop up out of nowhere. Sometimes I've actually seen like brand new morphs just randomly appear. Seems like the genetics in ball python is always changing, and sometimes you can really kind of fine tune exactly what you're going for just from the offspring from a few breeding seasons. And as a matter of fact, I've seen some people, so for example, if you're working with dark genes like maybe cinnamon or like a GHI or something like that, you're looking to incorporate maybe a bamboo into some of your dark morphs, you can actually search out and pick the really dark bamboos to incorporate it into some of your dark projects. Sometimes you can really fine tune projects that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to the internet, and I want to show you some of the amazing variability within specific morphs of ball pythons. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com, and I want to start with the albino ball python. Probably one of the best standalone recessive morphs in the ball python industry. It's really awesome. And take a look at this one. This is actually a really high contrast. I consider this a high contrast. And essentially what that is it has a really high definition between the yellows and the white. It has really sharp, clean lines around all the different kind of the patterns here and the white background. And if you kind of look at this one, it actually has kind of the alien heads, which you see kind of on a normal ball python, like the classic wild type ball python, kind of has these Roswell gray alien heads. And sometimes you actually see it in your albinos, and sometimes you don't. It's kind of interesting, the differences. And I want to show you this one compared to this one. Take a look at this. I would consider this one a low contrast. As a matter of fact, I actually have 2 albino females. One's a high contrast and one's a low contrast, and you can definitely see the difference between the yellow and the background is kind of blurred around all the patterns. And a lot of times you'll actually see where the background is not really a stark white. Sometimes it's kind of almost a really light yellow. And on my particular snake that is low contrast, it's kind of interesting because it almost looks like the base color is high contrast, and someone just took a really light color of yellow and in certain spots kind of like took a paintbrush or something and kind of painted on this low contrast, which gives it a really unique look. And I'd say there's really not one that's better than the other. It really depends on what you're shooting for. Sometimes it depends on what kind of deal you have. Sometimes if you're offered or you get an opportunity to buy a female, you're looking at something that's ready to breed. You don't really care if it's high contrast or low contrast sometimes when you jump into these projects. But it's really interesting, the difference between them. And I want to show you one more. This one is completely different than the other 2. This is actually more of like a high white albino versus the other ones, which they had pretty much like a 50-50 or a lot more yellow than white. Sometimes you can actually see one versus the other. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through several genes, and I want to show you 3 extreme examples of each of these where you can really see some big differences in the appearance of these. And keep in mind, these are all the same line of albino. These are all compatible. You can breed them all together. They're just different visual representations of the same gene. So here's another one. This is actually the snake that I had around my neck at the beginning of the video. This is a ad over here on Morphmarket for Bobby. This is back when I bought him. Really awesome bamboo. And you can see this one is kind of unique. It almost looks like it has some calico or something in it. Although it doesn't have calico, the spider is almost the same way, where it has a lot of white coming up the sides and it has a really sharp defined pattern down the top. So take a look at this bamboo over here. This one is completely different. There's really no white coming up. It's as a matter of fact, this almost looks like a couple of Bobby's babies that I hatched out that were really dark morphs, just kind of a random anomaly. And I was wondering if I actually took some of those dark ones and then bred them out, if I'd actually get a whole line of darker looking bamboos. It'd be kind of interesting. I haven't really followed those snakes. They're probably not old enough to actually breed. I think I just produced them last year, but it'd be interesting to see how some of these would actually prove out and what the offspring would look like. I actually pulled up one more bamboo. Take a look at this one. This one is pretty amazing. This almost looks like an axanthic bamboo, but it's just a straight bamboo. It looks completely different. You don't really see like the gold, kind of a yellowish gold color. It's almost like all stripped out. It's pretty amazing. I don't think I've produced any bamboos that really have this kind of a gray, almost like a stone looking appearance to them. It's pretty awesome, the differences in the bamboos. Here's another one that's extremely variable. That is the Pastel. This is just one copy of the Pastel gene. And Pastel is I'd say it's probably one of the most variable things that I've seen in ball pythons. And it's really inexpensive too. As a matter of fact, I've seen some people holding adult Pastels that are really super bright, kind of like this one. And I've seen some that you kind of have to look really close. Is that really a Pastel or is that a normal? Sometimes the colors kind of fade or don't, they're not really that intense. So I'd say in most cases, in most Pastels, as they age, the color fades a little bit, but you can get extreme examples even if you're comparing hatchlings side by side. So this is a really bright yellow one. Take a look at this one here. This is kind of interesting because it's almost an orange Pastel. It's kind of interesting. In my collection, I actually have multiple lines of Pastel. Some of them are really bright. Some of them are kind of this orange color, and some of them, even as hatchlings, are pretty browned out. You can definitely tell they're Pastel, but they look completely different from some of the other ones. And I'd say in most cases, Pastel brings out mainly, I'd say, a yellow color. Sometimes it'll bring out an orange color, and it also reduces the pattern of the snake. You can see a lot of these, they don't really have the alien heads. You can see one little kind of Roswell gray alien head here, but I'd say in most cases it really reduces the pattern to where you don't get those alien heads. I wanted to show you one more Pastel here. This one is really unique. It's kind of like halfway in between the last ones. We have a really bright yellow on top, and then you have kind of the orange on the sides, which is really interesting that you'd actually, it makes me wonder if you actually bred those last two together, if you would get some offspring like this. And you can tell on this one, the pattern is really reduced on the sides. Pretty amazing variability. Here's another one that I find that's just really amazing. It really blows me away. And when people start showing me pictures of the lesser ball python, the lesser is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic. If you breed two of them together, you get an all-white snake with blue eyes. And I don't really think it matters on the white snake what line you start with or what the parents look like. I think the white snake is the white snake. It doesn't really matter. But if you actually look at the individual genes, there's huge variability in lessers pretty much across the board. I can almost guarantee my lessers don't look like your lessers. So take a look at this one. Essentially what it is it reduces the patterns on the sides, turns them into almost these keyhole. Sometimes you get this black outline, and sometimes you get a really bright yellow. Sometimes it's orange like this, which is interesting. So take a look at this one, and let's compare it to this lesser. Take a look at this. This is like, it has less pattern, and it has a brighter yellow. And as a matter of fact, if you're going through these snakes, sometimes, especially as a novice, it's really difficult to actually figure out what these snakes look like, what they're supposed to look like, because there's so many variations of a theme in one specific snake. And if we actually compare these last two snakes to this last lesser here, take a look at this one. This one almost has no yellow at all. It's almost completely browned out. And if you were to tell me, you know, when I'm first starting to ball pythons, that this one is the same as this one, I would think, you know, it's almost hard to believe that these two snakes are actually the same gene, just different examples of the morph. So another one I wanted to show you is the Mojave. The Mojave is similar to the lesser. It's in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. Makes some really interesting combos. I think the Mojave GHI is probably my favorite combo. And as a matter of fact, if you're looking for the perfect blue-eyed leucistic, you breed a Mojave to a lesser and you get a Mojave lesser, which is a really stark white with really bright blue eyes. Probably the best blue-eyed leucistic you can get. And take a look at this Mojave. It looks completely browned out. And compare that one to this one. Take a look at this, and I would say this is pretty much your typical Mojave, where you have kind of these same keyhole kind of patterns, and you have, I would say it's usually brighter than a lesser as far as the yellow coming down the back, and you definitely tell the difference between a Mojave and a lesser in most cases. And it can kind of tricky because you can have so many examples of the different morph. Someone shows you a snake, it's really hard in some cases to actually pick out the genes because they can be so variable even within just one version of that specific gene. So this is the last one I wanted to show you of the Mojave, and take a look at this one. Look at the stripe down the back and look at the reduction in pattern. And it's, you know, some of these, it's almost like, is this really just a Mojave or is there something else in there? Sometimes it's almost hard to believe that this snake is the same as this snake. It just kind of blows me away that there's so much variability within a gene. Here's another one that has a lot of variability, and that is the Leopard. Now, obviously, the Leopard is pretty much the king of combos when it comes to co-dominant mutations. You breed a Leopard to anything else, half the offspring have Leopard in it. And Leopard is, I would say, is as far as kind of changing the color and the pattern, usually the Leopard doesn't really change the color that much. It is a pattern enhancing gene. A lot of times you can actually see, take a look at this one. This is probably the best example of a Leopard that I've ever seen, with really crazy pattern coming right down the sides. But compare this one with this Leopard. Take a look at this. It's actually, if you compared these side by side, you'd be hard pressed to say that this is actually a Leopard. It's pretty amazing. And sometimes they'll surprise you. You can actually take these really subtle Leopards and you can mix it with other genes and get some really dramatic results, because a lot of times in these combos it'll really shine like a Leopard is supposed to shine. It doesn't really matter on the base gene in a lot of cases. And it's kind of interesting though, if you put them side by side. Take a look at this last Leopard over here. This is so completely different than the last two snakes. As a matter of fact, when I first saw this, it almost looks like it has super pastel in it because of the banding right along the back. This is kind of typical of the super pastel. Of course, with the super pastel, you get a lot more colors, like the white bands coming through the black, and you see like a white head with the super pastel. I just thought this was a really unique example of a Leopard. So I wanted to show you this last one. This is a clown. The clown's a recessive mutation, and I'm actually breeding clowns this time for the first year. I actually bred a clown last year and got my triple hets. I bred my albino pied clown, my albino pied to my clown, and I got triple hets, albino pied clowns, working on breeding those up and breeding those together. That is probably my most exciting project in my whole breeding operation. And I'd say clown is really hot because you mix anything with clown and you get some really amazing combos. The only thing that's really kind of a weird quirk with clowns is that it's really variable as a standalone morph. I'd say this is kind of the typical clown right here if someone would show me a clown, but take a look at this clown. I've actually seen some really reduced patterns of just the clown, and sometimes you can mix other genes in like blade or Enchi, and in some cases you don't have either one of those genes and you still get a really reduced clown like this. Is pretty amazing. And here's another one. If you actually look at this one, doesn't have much pattern on the sides at all, but take a look at this last one I wanted to show you. This one has a lot of spots on the side and has a lot of reduced pattern. I think this is probably one of my favorite clown kind of versions. Keep in mind, these are all the same. You can actually breed them together and you get all visual clowns. And I'm not really that familiar with clowns. I haven't produced a lot of them to know if you actually breed some of these together, what the appearance of the offspring will look like, or if it's just kind of random, kind of like a random appearance through the whole clutch of offspring. Sometimes you can actually breed some stuff and you get all the babies looking the same. Sometimes you can get them to where they all look different from one to the other. It's kind of interesting, especially with the clown. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Constrictor Construction asks, do you ever worry about your rats biting you? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I do breed rats and mice as a food source for my snakes. And I'd say in most cases, my rats are pretty friendly. I've never really, well, I'd say I've never been bitten, but actually this week, I actually did take a pretty good bite from one of my rats. And I would say that time was actually an accident. Essentially what I did is I make sourdough bread every couple days. And the bread that I don't use, like day-old bread or a couple days old, I chop it up in little pieces and I give it to all my rats kind of going through the tubs. And I was actually feeding them some sourdough and I ran out and I was going through some other tubs, just kind of checking them out, seeing how they were doing. And I opened this tub and one of the rats thought my finger was a piece of bread and he grabbed onto my finger and it just kind of freaked me out. And when I pulled back, that rat went flying across the room and actually hit the floor. I felt really bad for the rat, and luckily it didn't break the skin. He just hung on pretty good. It freaked me out, it freaked the rat out, and luckily the rat didn't get hurt at all. I put it back in the tub and it was fine, but that was probably the first time I've really been bit by a rat. And I'd say in most cases, if you treat rats well, they remember and they really, it's kind of like, treating any animal. If you treat an animal rough, it can definitely get mean on you, especially rats. I've seen some people with really super mean rats that they can't even get close to, and you definitely want to respect your rats, treat them nice, and you definitely don't want to abuse rats. I would say kind of treat them like a dog, especially if a rat gets really mean, kind of like a dog. Sometimes you'll never get them back to the friendly state. Sometimes they can kind of go ballistic. I saw one guy who's actually breeding some rats, and he had a rat that was so mean. The rat actually had babies, and the rat was so mean he couldn't actually go in there to get the babies, and you definitely don't want to end up with a situation like that. And I'd say usually rats are really friendly for the most part. You don't really have to worry about getting bit from a rat if you treat them with respect. And I'd say there's a few times when rats can get a little bit cranky, and that is when I open up a tub. If I'm looking in there and trying to get a rat, sometimes if you have a female that is sitting down on her babies and just sitting there kind of staring at you, you definitely don't want to go in there hand first. You kind of want to get around the side and move around. This is pretty common, especially since I go in and clean my tubs every few days. I'm always moving rats from tubs to tubs, so I always have to go in there and handle the rats. You definitely want to be able to move them from enclosure to closure without getting bit. It's one of the things. And then the other time is when rats kind of get more cranky, is when they get really super old, and they get, I think they kind of get a lot of arthritis, and they kind of get, it's kind of like any animal. Once they get in a really bad state, especially towards the end of their life, I can definitely tell they get a little bit more cranky. They don't really like to be touched at all, but I would say that's kind of the exception with rats. Usually they're pretty friendly. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.